Hello and welcome. I'm Kirti, and today we are joined by Mr. João Santos. He's a central figure in development of Europe's Center for Vocational Excellences, and he's a long-standing architect in European Union skill and innovation policy. Mr. Santos, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Kirti. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. And I'm going to take it from where we left at the Roundtable Conference couple of weeks back, where you had argued that well being is not peripheral but foundational to inclusive skills ecosystem. And then I come back and I'm having this conversation, and the person says to me, Kirti, right now I'm grappling with money market dynamics, and the whole idea of psychological well being feels like an oxymoron to me. So, this is my first question to you. I'm very curious to know how do you respond to that view? Because whether we are talking about Europe or high growth economies like India, competitiveness is still being measured primarily in capital investment, technology adoption, and short term performance indicators. So, in this scenario, if empowerment is to become economically credible rather than rhetorically appealing, what institutional incentives would actually need to change?
Well, I perfectly understand that, companies and even governments, if you want, they usually focused on short term cycles, things that they can deliver on. A government is elected for 4 or 5 years, and they want to make sure that at the end of 5 years, they can say, we built so many hospitals, or we built so many schools. It's things that can be seen and can also bring votes, of course. And companies, the same thing, that they are functioning to make sure that by the end of the year they can show profits, that they can the stakeholders can be, or shareholders can be, happy with the results. And investing in human capital and investing in social emotional learning is something that will have returns throughout the life of individuals, but that governments and companies cannot present as successes immediately. So I understand these constraints. However, what we've got to see is that the world is changing very, very fast. And what happens is that we see increasing levels of mental health disorders in society in general. There are statistics that show that 1 in every 7 people in this planet suffer some kind of mental challenge, which is something very, very significant. Also, in schools, you see more and more children that, also because of AI and because of all the social media challenges and so on, and because of the change, just keeping up with change is very, very demanding. And if people are not empowered to confront these challenges, if teachers themselves are not empowered to confront these challenges, it is very difficult to cope. And it makes no sense that we are investing in education systems that people have skills. They leave the education system with certain skills. They are happy to have a diploma saying that they are good in this or that field of activity. But then, if they're not capable of managing their own mental health and their well-being, I mean, they cannot be productive. And companies will understand this, either because they are wise enough to foresee this and to do something about the well-being, not only of the staff that are there, but governments, in terms of developing education systems where people manage to be resilient and address these challenges that they will face throughout the world. And there's a very curious statistic that says that as I mentioned, 1 in every 7 school children are coping with mental challenges. And what we know is that 50% of those confront these challenges before the age of 14. So can you imagine this? That 1 in every 7. So if you go into a school or into a classroom with 35 children, there'll be 5 of them that have serious mental challenges. This can be anxiety because of exams, can be of mental challenges because they have troubles at home, or their parents, they don't see their parents or whatever. But the things, what we know is that mental challenges and mental well-being should be addressed from the school level, because if you do it later on, knowing that half of mental disorders start before the age of 14. If you do it later on, it will be much more expensive. And to address those issues, while everyone goes to school, so why not use schools, for example, to address this? And of course, it's not only a matter of young people, also adults. You see more and more growing cases, also because of AI, because of technological developments. People have difficulty in coping with those challenges. And companies will realize sooner or later that they've got to do something about it. Not only companies, but also governments. There are statistics that show that the investment in mental health and well being of $1 has a return on investment of $4. And why? Because of reduced absenteeism, because of more motivation that people have, because we all have, challenges in our personal lives, in our professional lives. And if we are empowered to address those challenges, the society and companies and the economy all benefit from this. So I think, the cost of doing nothing is much higher than the cost of doing something. But of course, as you rightly said, it's difficult to quantify the return on investment. Companies don't care about it. I think the issue of information is extremely important. These statistics that I spoke to you about, they are widely available. They're not from the European Union, from World Health Organization, OECD, and so on. And people have to become increasingly aware that there is a cost of not doing anything. And the estimate right now is that every year in the whole world there's a loss of $1 trillion, 1 trillion, not 1 million or 1 billion, 1 trillion US dollars, because of absenteeism, because of people, having to retire earlier because they cannot address, they go into depression and so on. So I think this is an issue that is becoming increasingly relevant, and both governments and companies have to stop just thinking about the immediate returns, the returns at the end of the year, but seeing their contribution. What are they doing to ensure that the workforce is capable of being productive, of being capable of contributing more to the economy and to the productivity of the company.
That's a very interesting point that you have made, and it makes me wonder, how do we get to that stage where it is taken seriously? Because policymakers and investors, they speak a lot about human capital. A couple of days back, I was speaking to this person who's a partner in one of the private equity firms in Portugal. He was also saying that mental health is somewhere that he and his firms are looking for investment, like it's a big place for investing. While they say that, emotional resilience is still not treated as a long term economic infrastructure. Because, as you said, when governments build buildings, they can see profit and loss can be shown on spreadsheets, but uh, emotional resilience can't. So, what do you think? What are the systemic assumptions or constraints that are holding back this shift that policymakers are, and investors are trying to make? They want to make, but they are not able to make.
Yeah, it is a difficult issue because, as I said, there's this constant pressure to provide results today, and social emotional learning is something that you acquire, you have today, but the impact of it in the economy, so the return on it is long term. I think that society and the economies are changing very fast, also pushed very much by AI, which is another thing which I think we might address later on. But what happens is that uh, we cannot look at human capital the way we used to do it before. Being traditionally, the way we've measured human capital is by the qualifications you have, the number of years you studied, and what are your technical qualifications. Now, what we know is that the shelf life of skills is becoming shorter and shorter. So if you become a good plumber or a good electrician or a good engineer in a certain field, the skills you acquired in university or technical school will have a shorter and shorter duration. And how can those skills be upgraded and adapted, or upskilling and reskilling to new areas? Is if people are empowered to learn, to unlearn, to learn once again, to engage in lifelong learning, to be active and take action on what is necessary in order for them to be employable. So there has to be an empowerment of people, and you cannot just say empowerment without any substance being given to it. You've got to empower people through education, through the skills, the way we are teaching people still in schools, that it's a matter of years you are in university, or a matter of years you are in upper secondary education, and the scores you get for certain subjects. This is not enough, because, as I said, the shelf life is shorter. It's all these other elements that are necessary, and for that you need really society to understand that this is the reality. You cannot expect, like you could, I don't know, 3 or 4 decades ago, that someone going out of university would have a job for life. It doesn't happen like that any longer. I remember in the European Commission, we did a study some years ago that someone entering into the labor market at this moment can expect up to 14 transitions in their active life. So you can imagine this requires a constant learning and relearning. So the whole of society, also for companies, because what the company is doing today, especially with artificial intelligence, I think this is something quite visible. Their tasks and their object of operation will change for sure in the next few years. And if you have people that are static, that are not capable of taking agency over their own career progression and need for upskilling and reskilling, engaging in lifelong learning, we will not be successful. So I think this issue of information, of people being aware, and at the end of the day, sometimes you don't need a lot of financial incentives. The economy itself is a school that teaches companies that unless they do something about the way they invest in human capital, the economy will show them, because the company next door that is investing in the human capital, that is making sure that people are empowered to have agency, as I said, and this I'm talking about everyday work. If you are in a factory, if you are in a company where you have the initiative, where you have entrepreneurial attitudes, and I'm not talking about entrepreneurial in the sense of building a new company, but of looking at the problem, trying to solve it without your boss trying to tell you. And this is something that you learn, that you invest, and companies have to make sure that their staff are not just executing tasks, but are doing it well, but also looking at alternatives. How can I do this better? How can I make sure that the result of my investment in everyday work that I'm doing can result better for the company? And this is really a cultural change that has to happen.
Thank you. I really like the distinction that you made between how skills market was earlier and how it is today, and how AI is reshaping so much and so quickly. I'm curious to know how, in such a scenario, how do we protect the human side? Because how can skills ecosystem intentionally build resilience and ethical judgment in digital training so technological adoption can strengthen institutional trust rather than straining it?
Yeah. I think that until recently, schools and institutions and the economy in general were focusing on individuals, focusing on the resilience of individuals, their skills, their competences, to the extent that these were necessary or were a good contribution to the economy and society. So the individual was seen, okay, we form people, we give them skills, we qualify them to the extent that what we are doing, they are useful for the machinery we have. I'm talking about, the economy, the companies, what we need. We are training people for the economy that we need. I think that the mentality has to change in the sense of not looking at the employability aspect of people, so training people for employment, for the economy, for the institutions that are there, but instead training people to empower them, to make them agents of change, and not simply a piece in the machinery. We are training them, schools are training, universities, so that these people enter the economy, and then they are one of the many elements that are there as a sort of element of production. I think that there has to be a change if we understand that many of the routine tasks that we have right now in the economy are going to be displaced by AI. So if we have jobs being displaced, or activities or tasks being displaced by AI, what kind of skills or what kind of empowerment do we have, or approach should we have to make sure that we are empowering people to be positive elements of society and not do necessarily all those technical tasks that we used to do until now, which for sure in the next might take 5 years, might take 10 years, but AI and robots will certainly do a lot of those tasks. So the concentration of the education system, of the economy, has to be on the individual per se, what they can do, how can we make them the agents of change, being, having the agency to contribute to society and also to themselves, to their well-being. And that should be the central point of focus, and no longer of how can I train this person to be useful for society. So how can I train this person so that the skills they have are useful for them? Because then this will trickle down to the society. If you have empowered people, if you have people that are capable of understanding change and rapidly adapting to it, upskilling and reskilling throughout their lives, then you have an economy that works well and very flexible because people are capable of doing it. If you don't have this kind of approach, if we still look at people just as elements that contribute to the economy, then we will be faced with tremendous problems. And I think, managers and governments, they are attentive to this, but it's not an easy solution. It's not easy to do. You don't change these things from one day to the other. But I think there's a lot of work being done in that respect. In Europe, we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is trying to put people at the center of the economy. So not having economic development for the sake of economic development, just to say that the GDP is going up, but have economic development that favors the person so that the individual is an instrument of economic development, but also the main beneficiary of it. Because if we don't do that, we're going to create a society which is not socially cohesive. You'll have the winners and all the rest, and where all the rest are just contributing to the winners have more and more. And we see that happening in many countries in the world, where the social inclusion is becoming more and more difficult. You have people filthy rich, I would say, and then you have all the others that are just managing to survive. And I think a society like that is not sustainable in the long run. That's when revolutions happen, that's when social unrest happens, and we've got to be attentive to this. Governments are certainly attentive to it, but it is difficult. And we see, if you see what is happening in the US, for example, where you have a very small minority of people that have a very large ownership of wealth. I mean, in the long run, this is not sustainable. I mean, it's not the kind of world that we would like to have, at least not in Europe.
That's a very powerful framing, and it naturally brings me to mobility. Today, talent is very fluid.
Yeah.
So, in such a scenario, what role does belonging play? Like, how, for example, Portugal, it is positioning itself as an innovation hub. India is a talent exporter and importer at the same time, and the landscape is very mobile. So, how central is psychological belongingness to long term competitiveness? And should we begin to treat it as an economic variable rather than a policy concern right now?
Well, mobility is a very big issue. And, there's big discussions on brain drain, brain circulation as well. And, some countries in Europe, we have this issue. I think India also has, because India is investing strongly in skills. And then you see some of your brightest people going abroad. But I don't think this is bad. I don't think that India or Portugal should restrict people going abroad, because it's, if you look at history, human history, people have always moved to where they have better living conditions, be it financial, be it social, nice environment where they can have security, where they can have their children going to good schools. It's legitimate that everyone does it. I mean, you do it. I'm Portuguese. I lived in many countries throughout the world because I was looking for better life conditions, better jobs where I feel more empowered and so on. And I think everyone does it, and it's perfectly normal. But I think there's a positive aspect to this, even when people leave their country to go somewhere else. I mean, look at India. You've got the CEO of the biggest US companies, which are Indians, and then this even if some people sometimes say, well, we are training people to then go and be productive somewhere else. But this is a short-sighted view. It's not the issue of brain drain, it's brain circulation, because quite often what you see is that if India creates the good conditions for these people to come back, they will come back. Or even if they don't come back, they'll invest in other spin-offs, in other kinds of activities that will develop in India. So I think that this issue of mobility is important. It's important that people, if they don't find the conditions to develop their skills in the country where they are, either because the country doesn't have the right environment, doesn't have right incentives to it, even when they go out, it's not necessarily a loss for the country, because all of us, I mean, in the end, we all like to return to the country where our families are, where we feel safe, where we grew up. It's normal. I mean, in my case, I lived in Portugal. I was born in Portugal. I lived outside, and when I retired, I came back to Portugal. It's normal. It's legitimate that that happens. So I think that for the case of India, for example, in when we're talking about mobility, of course, if besides technical competences, you provide people with skills for entrepreneurship, for example, that they will have the skills that will allow them with the knowledge, the technical knowledge they have, to then, okay, I'm going to do. India might not have the right job for me, but I'm going to create it because I've got the entrepreneurial school skills that will allow me to make a difference in the country where I am. I'm sure that a lot of people would prefer to stay in India than go somewhere else. They will just go there. I mean, when I say India, I say Portugal, any other country. They'll just move because they find there are better opportunities. But even if they do it, it's good. Even if they move abroad, it's good, because if you go abroad, you're going to apply the skills that you learned in your home country. You are going to develop them, and eventually you will either come back or help other people in your own country to develop, spin-offs, other entrepreneurial initiatives. So I think in the end, it's globally positive. And when people just speak about brain drain, I have no doubt sometimes it does happen. In Europe, we have countries like Romania and Bulgaria that invested heavily in, for example, health services, in medical schools, and then they see these doctors, as soon as they are qualified, they go somewhere else because the salaries are 2, 3, or 4 times higher. Of course, that's a brain drain. Of course, that's a cost for the economy. But I think that what they've got to do is create incentives so people not want to go outside, develop the economy, pay these people better, create better working conditions, and most probably people will not leave, at least not to the numbers that they are leaving. But I think that the brain drain is a limited vision of the thing. We've got to really look at brain circulation. There's no problem of Indians coming to Europe or Europeans going to India and all of this circulating in the end. So because what is the alternative? Not invest in people because they might leave somewhere else tomorrow. Is that an alternative? Will that provide better conditions for India? Certainly not.
This is a very interesting take you have on cross border settings, and I would like you to elaborate a bit more in terms of how uh, Europe's skills architecture, it emphasizes on cohesion and regional balance,
Yeah.
while India is about scale and speed. So, what principles do you think can genuinely transfer in these two contexts? And where do economic logics diverge in a way policymakers must acknowledge?
Yeah. Well, I think that inequality is a very big issue, even in Europe. I mean, inequality in India certainly is an issue, but even in Europe. And in that extent, I think there's a lot of scope for cooperation. And you might have heard that just a month ago, EU and India signed a free trade agreement. It's still, in the phases of being ratified. But in any case, I think it's a very good precedent because it can allow a sort of platform for further cooperation between Europe and India, not only in trade per se, but all other issues that have to do with a decent work agenda, skilling, and so on. So I think it forms a right basis of cooperation for other uh, other aspects to develop as well. But your question was on what aspects are.
My question was that on cross border settings and transferable skills, like Europe is about
Yes, yes.
cohesion
I
and
got
regional
sorry,
balance.
sorry, Kirti, I lost myself, but I was mentioning on inequality.
Happens.
On this
Yeah.
issue of inequality, there's a lot
Yeah.
of inequality between rural and urban areas. There's inequality between men and women. There's inequality in terms of salaries and wealth and welcome, and I think income. And I think that there is a serious risk that if we don't take this into consideration, and you were mentioning that Europe is very concerned about social cohesion, and India is in this aspect of speed because you've got, you are at a certain level of development that you need to do a lot and very quickly to catch up. And I think India is doing quite a lot in that respect. But the risk we've got to be careful. We are careful in Europe about it, but even like that, although we are careful, we have a lot of inequality. Of course, there are different levels or different weights of inequality. We have inequality between men and women in Europe. Sorry, because of salary differences. We have different men generally earn more than women. We have another inequality level that has to do with rural and urban areas, even within the same country. Sometimes you have in Germany, rural areas, or in Poland, rural areas and urban areas. There's a lot of inequality there. There's inequality, of course, in income. But I think if you look at India, I think the problems are even higher. Just to take an example, when I'm saying about inequality between men and women in Europe, I'm talking about a difference of about 14-15% of salary levels that happen in practice. Uh, but in India, if you go and look at the employment levels of women, it is extremely low. I think you've got one of the lowest employment rates of women in the world. And what this means in terms of dependency of women on either their husbands or the family or whatever, because they don't have the financial means to empower themselves, I think these are very big issues. But I think, as I was saying, and coming back to the free trade agreement, just before I got lost in the answer to what you were saying, I think there's a lot of scope for cooperation because, as you were rightly saying, India is very good in terms of speed and scale as well, because of course your population as the largest country with population in the world, you have this capability that's been developing very, very fast, especially in recent years. And we have this concern for social cohesion, and to ensure that even if we go slower, we all go together. While in India, your focus, I would say, as far as I might be wrong, but I think your main focus is, we were until a few years going through some trouble, and we want to catch up quickly. And I mean, you've been doing that. If you look at the amount of people that have access to internet today in India, it's gigantic. You've got more than 1 billion people with access to high speed internet. But if you then go and look at it, go and look at the people in rural areas where I think around 60% of the people of the Indian people still live in rural areas. If you look at the rural areas compared to the big cities like Mumbai or New Delhi, there's gigantic difference. So I think there's a lot of possibilities for cooperation between Europe and India. Of course, you are going very fast. We are going slower, but we try to bring as many people together as possible. But there we can learn from each other, certainly. Sorry.
So how do you think your cohesion and our scale can diverge?
Diverge. I hope they don't diverge, because if they diverge, it will mean that we are both in trouble. I think that Europe needs to, scale and speed more quicker than we are doing it now. And there you have good examples. I mean, and it's not all about Europe teaching India. I think we have a lot of things to learn. I saw your national education plan of 2020. I mean, it's one of the most comprehensive education plans in the world that really looks at the lifelong learning aspect of training and upskilling and providing people with skills. There's a lot of things that India is doing very well beyond the speed. I mean, the message I want to pass, it's not all about speed and scale that you are doing in India. It's really about substantive things that you are doing that we can learn from, because we also have this big challenge of upskilling and reskilling and, rethinking the whole education system. We've had a lot of initiatives, the skills agenda, the European education area. There's a lot of things that we are doing. Some are working quite well, others not so well. But I think India is also doing quite a lot of work. So there is a scope. And I would say that the main message that it's bilateral benefit that come from this. It's not that we have the secret of how to organize these things, how to empower people, how to make sure that people engage in lifelong learning. You are also doing, maybe not in the that everyone can benefit, and that's where I think there might be some scope for cooperation, in the sense that the teachings we have, or the lessons we have gained ourselves from the experience of making sure that society is cohesive, and what you are doing in very good policy planning initiatives that also have some implementation challenges, also because you are a gigantic country. It's much more difficult to do something in a country like India than doing something in a country like Portugal that has half the population of just one of your big cities. So, but just the key idea is that I think there is a scope for cooperation and bilateral in many areas, and what we are doing in education, for example, the Germans with the apprenticeship system, what the Finns are doing in terms of social emotional learning and ensuring that all their students are equipped with skills to adapt throughout life, the investment they are doing in teachers, not only Finland, but Estonia. There are quite a few countries in Europe that are doing exceptionally well in different areas. And, taking the best of these and seeing how, I wouldn't say they can be implemented in India, but how you can learn from this and then see how can this be useful and translated into what is the Indian reality. Because I don't think there's any case in international kind of cooperation where you can just take an idea and say, okay, I'm going to put this idea in my place. It always has to be contextualized. You always have to see what is the reality in my country, what are the difficulties. Although the idea is good, but it cannot just be transposed. It has to be really rethought in the context of what is your reality.
Thank you. That brings us to the bigger question about if we look ahead a decade, what do you believe will prove the greater constraint on future of work? Is it going to be technological disruption or institutional and emotional fragility? And if it is institutional and emotional fragility, what structural reforms would make empowerment a stabilizing force rather than a symbolic one?
Yeah. Well, we've already touched upon some of these issues. I think that the one of the most fundamental constraints that we have is definitely inequality. We've spoken about this, when we're talking about the future of work. And inequality in many aspects, some of them we've already covered. But I think, for example, with AI coming up, in which, talking about the future of work, I think the tasks and the jobs will change radically in the next few years. Everything that is kind of routine tasks will be replaced by AI and machine and robots and so on. So, and of course, this has advantages for all the professions that can be sort of enhanced with AI. So people working in, technologies or jobs where AI can sort of be a trampoline for them to do much better. This is good. But for all those people, and there are a lot of people that are at the risk of being considered obsolete, in the sense that, new tools, AI, the new technologies will replace these people. What are you going to do with them? What is society going to give them as an alternative? How are you going to retrain and give these people different possibilities? So this issue of inequality is extremely important. Then another constraint, I think, is the gender issue. We've already spoken about it partially, that low employment rates in India for women, and what is the impact of this in Europe. We also have a big gender issue, that we see that women are not as involved in STEM, the science, technology, and engineering, mathematics. They are not involved as much in these professions, and these are the professions that are going to be more that are going to profit more from the new technologies, namely AI. So if you have women that are in those sectors that are going to be more easily replaced, this will create more tension in the system. Another constraint, important constraint, I think, is institutional capacity. It's not enough to have excellent ideas. It's not enough to have excellent policies in place. You've got to make sure that the institutions, and when I'm talking about institutions, I'm talking about governments, I'm talking about companies, I'm talking about schools, that institutions have the capacity to implement this. And it's not trivial. It's not because you have a good strategy that suddenly the whole society is going to absorb it and everything is going to be perfect the next day. So institutional capacity can be a barrier to progress, and we've got to address this when we're talking about the future of work. And of course, an important constraint is the political economy. And by political economy is what we started our discussion about when I said that, governments and companies look at the economic impact, the balance sheet. What can I tell the public that was the results of my government in the 4 years I was in government? How can I make sure I'm re-elected? So they look at the results, at the profits, at the very, very short scale. And in companies, it's usually either even a quarter or a year, because they've got to show what the profit line was at the end of the day. So this change of political economy is important, because if we don't change this, the investment that I was talking about on, investing, empowering people, making them more resilient, making them more agents of change, will be, will be impacted if we continue looking at the short term. And I think that the most important fundamental constraint is trust. It is extremely important, and you might say, to why trust? But trust is extremely important, because if you don't trust the companies that are behind new technologies, new AI tools, new commerce platforms, if you don't trust them, you're not going to buy through them. If you don't trust the institutions that the government is creating, or if you don't trust the education system, you will not invest in skills. So this element of trust is extremely important. If you don't trust what is being built in AI, for example, you will maybe not use it as you would. For example, in Europe, one of the things we are doing, the AI Act, it's been very much criticized by some, but with the AI Act, basically what we are trying to do is design the fundamental rules for AI to be used or to be developed for the individual and not at the expense of the individual. As some people say that this is a constraint on innovation in AI. It might be, but who wants innovation in AI if in the end people will be enslaved by AI and not be capable of profiting from AI? So I think that these 5 constraints that I mentioned are the most important. So the issue of inequality, the issue of gender balance, the issue of institutional capacity, how capable are we to implement the reforms and the visions and the strategies we have for a country, the constraint on the political economy, the way we see profit and the way we see long-term investment in people, and finally this constraint on trust. If you don't build trust in the institutions, if you don't build trust in the way we interact with the economy, people will not engage it, and in the end, the objectives we have will not be achieved. So these are, going back to what you asked, the constraints for the future of work, or the constraints shaping the future of work. I would say these are the 5 most important.
And what structural reforms do you suggest?
Sorry?
I know. And what structural reform do you suggest for these
Structural reform.
constraints? Yes.
Well, it's
I think one is, schooling from primary level,
I would say that's the
reskilling
most important
there.
one.
Yeah, that is most important that you have said.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
other than
Well, first of all, I say it because I worked in education system all my life, so
yeah,
it's part of my sort of vision of
DNA.
the thing. But education, I think Nelson Mandela said it already, before. So I'm not being original in any way, but it's the most powerful tool to change the world, because all of us pass through education. It's the one thing where all of us go. If you just focus on women, if you just focus on men, if you just focus on a certain profession, or if you just focus on rule, you're always limiting. But if you focus on education, it's where everyone passes. So if even just talking about well-being and mental health, if while people are going through education, you empower them, you tell them, look, you might not have a mental health issue today, but you might have it in the future. You might, have a family breakdown, you might have a depression. And if you teach them that that is possible, but they have the power, they have the capability, and sometimes they've got to look for help somewhere else. But if you teach them that it is possible to address these issues, that this is not the end of life, they will be prepared for the rest of their life. If you don't do it, possibly when they go into the labor market, they'll have a divorce, they'll move house, they'll have a depression, maybe they will be fired, and they won't be able to deal with this. So school is good not only for teaching people technical skills, which they will certainly need for their work, but also these, I wouldn't call them soft skills because I think they're not an alternative, not the add-on. It's essential that schools focus not only on technical skills but empowering people with those skills for life, not only for learning, unlearning, learning again, that's very important, but also for managing their own lives, being resilient, being capable of addressing these shocks that everyone goes through life. I'm sure, Kirti, when you moved from India to Portugal, things are not easy because you move away from your comfort zone. People talk a different language, people have different attitudes, the way they go to the post office, simple things, the way they dress over there, all of these things are challenges. But and you need I mean, unless you are equipped with those resilience skills, capable of, I might have a difficulty, but I'll do it. And I'm sure you have it because otherwise you would have already left. Portugal is not an easy country for someone coming from a completely different culture like yours. But these are the skills that we've got to make sure that everyone has, that the school empowers the people to be capable of confronting these issues. So not only technical skills, surely they are necessary, because it doesn't make sense to just empower people with all these emotional or social emotional skills, and then they go into the job market and they don't know how to do anything. So it's the two things you've got, because as I said in the conference we had 2 weeks ago, uh, people that have good technical skills but not that are not empowered to live their lives in which they are agents of that change, they will go into the labor market. They have the first, the boss tells them something, not capable of dealing with it. You can be very good in technical skills. They will have zero impact in the company and zero impact in school. But on the other hand, if you have people that are very good communicating, that are very good addressing problems, but don't have skills, then you are cheating them, because you are telling them if you can talk a lot or if you can, address mental health issues, you're going to be successful. But that's not the case. I mean, if you have a pilot and he's very good in communicating, but he's not capable of, piloting his plane well, then it's a complete disaster. So, I mean, these two things have to go hand in hand. It's not a matter of option. Are we going to invest in social emotional skills, or are we going to invest in technical skills? The two things have to be done together if we want to have people that are empowered.
Thank you so much with your 5 constraints and the suggestion that structural reform will begin at schools. You have given me a lot to think about. And if empowerment really can serve as a buffer against systemic fragility, then this is a kind of decade defining conversation we need right now. And I'm grateful that today we could explore it at this level, and I hope we can continue it in future. Thank you, Mr. Santosh, for your time and expertise.
Thank you very much, Kirti.